This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 303 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Last week started off so strong. I talked up the Kansas City defense on the show. I talked up Royce Freeman. I talked down Damian Williams. We were cooking after Thursday's game. And then everything bad happened. The picks on this show weren't necessarily all that bad, but if you tuned into my Facebook Live on Sunday morning, you heard some bad takes. I had a bad Week 7. Here's to hoping the process corrects things in Week 8. Before looking at players that I'm higher and lower on versus the consensus for Week 8, I wanted to let you guys know that FanDuel's Thursday NFL Rush is back, which is a contest with $100,000 in prizes up for grabs. Build your lineup of players from Minnesota and Washington, turn on the game, and take your shot at the $10,000 first place prize, all for just $4. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Quarterback is kind of a mess this week. I think there are like 7 guys who should be locked in as QB1s, and there's just a bunch of question marks. So I'll start today with the 7th guy, and that's Matthew Stafford. He gets the Giants this week in Detroit, and New York's defense is what I would consider not great. They're 11th in fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, but they've allowed 5 top 10 performances this year. A big reason they haven't allowed more fantasy points is because they faced Washington when Case Keenum was benched, and then Kyler Murray didn't have a whole lot to do through the air this past week because they were so successful on the ground. On a per attempt basis, only Miami and Oakland are allowing more yards than the New York Giants. The only semi-fear that I have with Stafford is that the Giants haven't been horrifically bad at getting to the quarterback, but their pressure rate is a lot lower than their sack rate, so Stafford should be fine there. Digging deeper, I think Ryan Tannehill is probably the top streaming option this week. I talked about him on the 15 Transactions episode earlier this week, but Tampa Bay has been horrendous at stopping the pass this year. They faced one of the easiest quarterback schedules imaginable, but they still rank 12th in yards per attempt allowed. And they've allowed 2 or more touchdown passes in each of their last 4 games. Tannehill's at home. Tennessee's a 2.5-point favorite according to FanDuel Sportsbook, so he should be fine this week. Lastly, I wouldn't be shocked if Mitch Trubisky has somewhat of a bounce-back game. I mean, he was fine for fantasy purposes last week, but the majority of his production came in garbage time. But this matchup against the Chargers isn't as tough as what he saw last week. And last week was also a game where he was coming off an injury. The Chargers are pretty much average defensively across the board, including their pass rush. So if you're in a pinch, I think a contrarian move is to go Trubisky when no one else is going to be on him this week. You should easily be able to get him off the waiver wire. Some other options too would be Mason Rudolph and Derek Carr. I actually would like Carr a lot if he had better wide receivers, because that's a matchup to exploit against Houston. Now on the flip side, 2 players who I think may give you trouble this week, at least compared to where they're ranked, are Jacoby Brissett and Kyler Murray. Both of them are fine. They're just not great. They're fine. With Brissett, a big fear of mine is just general regression. He has a 6.8% touchdown rate this year, and that's likely not going to hold. He's been pretty fortunate in the touchdown column. 9 of his touchdowns have come from within the 10, and actually, all of those touchdowns have come within the 5. The player in second place in touchdowns from the 5-yard line is Carson Wentz, who has 5. That's 4 fewer than Jacoby Brissett. That'll eventually even out. And in a game where the Colts may be able to deploy a run-heavy game plan, given that they're touchdown favorites at home, the matchup isn't ideal. With Kyler Murray, I just worry about the matchup straight up. The Saints can get to the quarterback. They have the 4th best pressure rate and the 10th best sack rate in football. The Cardinals have the 7th highest sack rate allowed in football. I know Murray's done reasonably well over the last few weeks, at least in real football, but that also goes back to why he was a 15 Transactions buy candidate a few weeks back. It's because they faced the Bengals, the Falcons, and the Giants over their last 3 games. Those are 3 teams that rank in the bottom half of the league in pressure rate, and the Bengals and Falcons are bottom 5 in sack rate. I just worry about what New Orleans could do to Murray while playing at home. Now, I just talked about how the Colts could have a more run-heavy game plan this week to go along with Jacoby Brissett's incoming regression. And that should all benefit Marlon Mack. He's been fine, but I like him a good bit in this contest. He's seen 74% or more of Indy's running back carries in all but 1 game this year, and Denver's just been slightly above average at stopping the run according to NumberFire's expected points model. Basically, they're not a matchup, especially since they're on the road, since Denver's on the road, that I would actively avoid. So I like Mac a little bit more than where he's being ranked this week. Ty Johnson should be started as well. At the time of this recording, Detroit hasn't done anything to add to their running back depth chart. So we should assume Johnson, at least this week, is going to see a bit of work. Last week, without Kerryon Johnson for a chunk of that game, Ty Johnson ended up seeing half of Detroit's running back rushes and about a 9% target share. And he was also used as the red zone and goal line back. Against a Giants team that could easily allow the Lions to see a positive game script, he's a strong RB2 option. If you want to dig really deep, though, I think that you can look at Benny Snell. The Steelers are 2 touchdown plus favorites against Miami on Monday night, and Jalen Samuels is doubtful for that game. So it'll be James Conner back there, sure, but Benny Snell will get looks as well. The last time we saw Pittsburgh, which was in a game where they had a very strong positive game script, Snell had a 51% running back rush share with James Conner sort of banged up throughout that game. He may not reach that high of a share in this game, but if things get out of hand, which is always possible against Miami, Pittsburgh may not go nuts utilizing Conner, given that he's been injured this year. Now on the flip side, Derrick Henry is someone that I'm pretty low on this week. Usually he's a decent enough RB2. But Tampa Bay has been awesome against the run this year. According to NumberFire's expected points model, they rank first in expected points per rush allowed, and they're first in success rate allowed. And that's while facing Christian McCaffrey, Alvin Kamara, the 49ers running backs, the ghost of Todd Gurley, and 8 carries from Saquon Barkley. Considering Henry's not used a whole lot as a receiver, he has a 6.8% target share this year, I can understand if he's on your bench if you've got a team with a lot of good running backs. And then I'm going to bring up Joe Mixon once again this week. He's being ranked as a fringe RB2, but he's ranked higher than RB28 just once this season. Over the last 3 weeks, he's seen 2.7% of Cincinnati's targets, then 8%, and then 4.8%. That's not great. That's actually not very good at all. And his highest snap share this season is just 63%. He's really just an RB3 right now in fantasy football. Now at wide receiver this week, I think you should like every wideout for Houston with them going up against Oakland. But I want to talk specifically about Keke Coutee. He's going to play the majority of his snaps from the slot. That's where he's been lined up on over 70% of his snaps this year. And Oakland's been pretty bad against slot guys this season. According to data compiled from Pro Football Focus, over 35% of targets against Oakland have gone to pass catchers who are lined up in the slot. And they've allowed 6 slot touchdowns. That touchdown total is tied for the second most in the NFL. Coutee has seen about 15% of Houston's targets over the last 2 weeks, and he makes for a nice PPR fill-in in Week 8. DK Metcalf is also very much in play this week. Atlanta's been awful on defense, both in terms of pass rush and in the secondary, and they've now given up the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. They've also seen 71% of their receiving yards allowed go to opposing wide receivers, despite allowing just a 60% target share to that position. Now, the lack of target share isn't that big of a concern for me because the Seahawks don't have a ton of alternatives in that offense, especially with Will Dissly out for the year. But Metcalf also has over an 18% target share this season. So if he hits that mark again in Week 8, he should be able to take advantage of this matchup. Now, I mentioned Corey Davis as a sell candidate on this week's 15 transaction show, but I did note that his matchup against Tampa Bay this week is pretty good. Just to reiterate, the Buccaneers haven't faced unbelievable offenses this year, but they've given up 5 top 6 performances to wide receivers in 6 games played. Davis has seen about 24% of Tennessee's targets go his way with Ryan Tannehill under center, and this is a matchup where the Titans may be forced to pass given how well the Bucs have stopped the run. So while I do think that Davis is someone that'll be tough to trust through the end of the year, and while I do think that you should still use this matchup to your advantage if you're trading him away, I still feel pretty good that he can give you a wide receiver 3 floor this week. A deeper play this week is Ted Ginn. Now, I don't love the fact that Teddy Bridgewater is throwing at 15 or more air yards on just 11.8% of his passes. It's a clear downgrade if Teddy Bridgewater is his quarterback again here in Week 8. But Ginn has seen about a 15% target share over the team's last 5 games, and he's in a great spot against Arizona. He'll likely avoid Patrick Peterson, who could shadow Michael Thomas, so he'll see a lot of Byron Murphy. According to PFF, Murphy's allowed 3 touchdowns and 336 yards receiving this year, which are pretty bad marks. Arizona's been gashed by tight ends this year, but Ginn does have some sleeper potential. Now, on the other side of things, Alshon Jeffrey was someone who was featured on yesterday's 10 Trend show because he's seeing lots of volume. He has a really high target share, but he's seeing crappy production. He has an 8-yard average depth of target, which is really not what you like to see out of your wide receiver. Against Buffalo this week, one of the better teams at defending wideouts, you may have a better option. He's a high floor guy more than likely, but I do worry about that ceiling. And then you've got to bump down Curtis Samuel and DJ Moore this week. San Francisco is allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wideouts. They're playing at home. They have the best pressure rate in football, and the Panthers have the 4th lowest implied team total on this week's slate. So both Samuel and Moore are fringe starters in most leagues. Dawson Knox has seen his target share at 17% and 20% over his last 2 games. He's averaged 22 routes run per contest during this time, and he's on a team without a ton of alternatives at pass catcher. I really think he could be a lower-end tight end 1 from here on out. Now, that's not saying much, but I do think it's true. He has that chance. And he gets Philly this week, a team that continues to stop the run well, but not the pass. Even though most of their receiving production has gone to wide receivers, so John Brown is a very good play this week, Knox should be involved enough to be a relevant streamer here in Week 8. Now on Thursday night, I also kind of like both Minnesota tight ends. Kyle Rudolph and Irv Smith are decent enough dart throws in a game where Minnesota has an implied team total of 29. But Smith and Rudolph each had an 18% target share last week, and Washington's a team that's been beat more against tight ends and running backs than wide receivers this season. 23% of their targets against have gone to tight ends. It's one of the higher marks in the league, while just 52% of them have gone to wide receivers, which is one of the lowest. Now, receivers have done well, so don't bench Stephon Diggs, but this could end up being a matchup to exploit. On defense this week, I love the Detroit Lions as a streamer. I talked about this on my 15 transaction show, and they're 7-point favorites according to FanDuel Sportsbook, and they're facing Danny Dimes. And Daniel Jones has 4 starts since his big game against Tampa Bay. He's thrown 7 interceptions to 4 touchdowns, and he's been sacked 13 times. Defenses are now averaging 3.6 sacks per game against Daniel Jones. So I love Detroit in this matchup. And I also like the Colts. Indy now has the 9th best sack rate this season, and Denver ranks 5th worst in sack rate allowed. The Colts are at home, they're big favorites, and the Broncos no longer have Emmanuel Sanders. So for a second week in a row, you can stream against Joe Flacco. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And you can search for me on Twitter. I'm at Late Round QB. Hit me with the follow. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly mailbag show.